The Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation presents Our Story, hosted by the Foundation's chairman and president, Jason Villalba. Each week on Our Story, hear the personal and intimate stories of Hispanics all across Texas, told in their own voices. Our Story provides insight into a community of people who are literally and figuratively changing the complexion of the United States. This is who we are.
Welcome back to the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation's Our Story. Each week we bring you the intimate and personal stories of Texas Latinos from all walks of life, from politics to entertainment to food to business. We like to bring the stories of our community to you. Today we have a very special guest, someone who I had a chance to meet and spend some time with during my time in the Texas legislature. She is a brilliant politician, but also an amazing woman with just a unique story, and we're going to hear some of those stories today. She's a former senator from San Antonio and has a tremendous political career. We'll get into that as well. But I'd like to introduce you to my friend, Senator Leticia Van de Putte. Senator, how are you today?
Much better than I deserve, I can tell you that.
How have you been handling the COVID crisis? And are you at home with the family? How has that been for you?
Up until the beginning of January, we had been exceedingly blessed. My husband, myself, our 6 children and their children, all essential in the workplace, and our grandchildren had continued to test negative, even though we had been out and about in our jobs, but very careful. So many people have been. But we got together for New Year's, and lo and behold, that 4th of January, everybody started testing positive, including my husband. I did not test positive throughout the whole thing. In fact, I remained negative. And so everybody's back at work, but we did go through the 2-week quarantine, and only my husband was the one that really had to experience so much of the breathing treatment. He received the monoclonal antibodies, which really turned his situation around. So out of the woods, but it was scary for a couple of days when we couldn't get his oxygen level above 92. But thank you for asking. This thing is serious. And I believe the only reason that I was able to fight off that is that I had already received the first dose of the vaccine. I'm a pharmacist in real life, and our health department and our folks in the pharmacy world asked me to come back and administer vaccines. So I was able to do that. And when you administer vaccines, the first thing they do is give you one as a healthcare provider. So that's what I've been doing to help out, as well as, besides doing business and taking care of the family, and is taking a couple of shifts here and there so they don't have to pull some pharmacist or a nurse or a doctor or a physician's assistant, somebody else off a shift to give vaccines.
This is a real virus that impacts people. And I think the numbers now have made it clear that this is certainly something to take very seriously. And even if we start to feel comfortable about situations, we cannot let our guard down because of what's happened. I mean, it's impacting everyone's lives. We lost my grandfather last year to COVID, and I've lost a couple of distant cousins, but cousins nonetheless. And, it's impacted your family. We've just got to remain diligent until this vaccination gets into the system. And hopefully by the middle of the year, we'll start to see some semblance of normalcy. But your point's well taken. Let's talk about you. I want to talk about your life story. I want to start from the very beginning. I know that you're originally from Tacoma, Washington, and you got to Texas as soon as you could. That's what everybody says. But tell me about growing up in Tacoma. How did your parents in there? How did your grandparents end up there? And what's the beginning of the senator's life like?
I'm kind of like a 7th generation Texan. My maiden name is San Miguel. So on my dad's side, always in the border area, Maverick County. And yet both my grandmothers were born in Mexico. My dad and mom were born in San Antonio. But during the Korean War, shortly after they were married, he got stationed actually at Fort Lewis in Tacoma, Washington for a few years. And I was born there.
Grandmas and grandpas come from Mexico. So grandfathers as well, or just the grandmothers?
Just the grandmoms. The granddaddies were born here in the United States and their family too. So I've got one of those mixed histories in that the abuelitas came from Mexico, but I'm also daughters of the Republic of Texas because I have ancestors that fought for independence for the Republic. And there are so many Tejano families like that.
My father's family had been here for over 100 years, and my mother came directly from Mexico. And so, a lot of us share that mixed family history. Look, in our community, we know that it's a very maternalistic society, and our families are driven by the grandmothers. Did you spend a lot of time with your grandmothers growing up, the ones from Mexico, and did they have a big influence on you?
Absolutely. Both grandmothers. My dad's mom was Velia Garza, but she was from Musquis, Coahuila, and her family was that mix, but had a lot of German ancestry, as that part of Mexico had what we call mineros, or miners. She was the baby of 10, and 4 of them had the bright red hair and blue eyes. Hence, my sister's a redhead, my brother's got reddish hair, and my grandson is a redhead. And every once in a while, that red hair and blue eyes will pop up, including 3 of my children. So that was Velia Garza, but she was also long. You've got those German influences in Mexico. And I think a lot of people don't realize that Bohemia, the beer, it's Bohemian, right? Polka music, right? So much of the music and the food, especially if you talk about norteño and the border, it's a mix of cultures. And my family is no different. I can tell you that was on that side, Musquis, Coahuila, that was Belia Garza. My mom's mom, though, was from Guadalajara. And my great-grandparents were from Guadalajara. And I was so blessed to have a very loving and strong relationship with both my grandmothers. And they didn't pass away until they were both in their late 80s. Beautiful, strong women, never went past the 3rd grade, either of them. But my grandmother, Guadalupe, we called her Memo, that was my mom's mom, wrote poetry. And she became a U.S. citizen, thank you, President Reagan, at the age of 68. My other grandmother never became a citizen. So we're like kind of many families where they came during either the 1910 or the 1922 revolution. Their families came to San Antonio or to Texas or to the areas, and then they ended up marrying Tejanos, right? They ended up marrying and having their families. But my both grandmothers had things in common. They were devoted to their family, the Catholic Church. They were great seamstresses and wonderful cooks. And I can tell you, other than learning to be a great seamstress, I probably took the best skills of the kitchen from both of them.
Did the grandparents live in your household? So many of us have histories where we have shared homes with multi-generations. Did the grandparents live with you guys?
None of them ever lived with us when I was little. However, my grandmother, after she suffered a stroke, came and lived with Pete and I and our 6 children for 6 years while my mom was still working. So my grandmother lived with us, and there was a time when Pete and I lived with my grandmother. We were buying a house and it didn't get done, and so we lived with her for about 6 months. So yes, I mean, she lived with us, and it was a joy to have her. And we were Spanish speaking. My parents spoke Spanish in the home, and both grandmothers spoke Spanish. So I was sent to a Catholic school for kindergarten with nuns from France and Mexico so that I would better learn English. My staff in the legislature always teased me because they would always have to correct anything I wrote. Although I don't really speak with an accent, when I'm writing something, I still put my adverbs in the wrong place. So if you listen, you know when people are first another language speaker, sometimes by their sentence construction. So for example, Jason, if we were going to leave a room and I wanted to make sure that to conserve electricity, that all the lights are out, somebody would say, turn off the lights.
Turn off the lights, right.
I say, turn off it, because I don't know that I'm saying, but it's apágalo, right? So they would always have to do things different because my adverbs and verbs would always be in the wrong place. But looking at it, I don't catch that. So my sentence constructions are always, and what we find too now that the data shows that, it's about children and bilingual learners on their content. But as a young girl, I always struggled with that type of English and grammar. And I geared toward math and science because that's finite. Numbers and chemical structures are finite. There's no place to put other things. It's just one thing.
Many Texas Hispanics will speak Spanish, and it's often a result of having lived in a home with someone who speaks Spanish regularly, and you hear it regularly. But so many of us, including myself and some, very well-educated Latinos around the state, have lost the language. The reason I lost it was because my parents, growing up in Dallas, Texas in the 50s, in the public schools were taught, don't speak Spanish at home, don't speak Spanish at school.
Jason. Yes.
Yeah, back in those days, they wanted to sort of eliminate that. So my parents never spoke Spanish in the home. I never learned it. It's a tremendous regret for me. I'd love to learn it again, for sure.
Well, that's exactly why my parents stopped speaking Spanish in our home. That was the rules back then, that you could not speak Spanish. And I was sent home because I accidentally spoke Spanish in the schoolyard. And I knew the rules, but, children playing, and I was in the third grade. By that time, we had moved to a public school because our English proficiency was enough. My brother, the boys got spanked, the girls got sent home. But from that day on, my parents, just like your parents, only spoke English in the home. And it wasn't because they weren't proud of their heritage or their culture, or they didn't feel comfortable. Their love for us and their hope that we would be successful meant that we needed to abide by the rules of the time. And so I experienced that change when I was in third grade. And my grandmothers, of course, still spoke Spanish, but they began to pick up English words here and there. And my parents did not speak to each other in Spanish. They spoke to each other in English. And that's when that change happened. And you're right. I mean, there are so many folks that is the case. But believe me, it wasn't out of maliciousness or anything other than wanting their children to succeed and abide by the rules. We were lucky that changed. And now we know that the prime example of that is it's imperative to learn another language, and especially the language of your number one trading partner. It's a business plus.
Right. You're talking about your parents, and it's clear from just how you speak about them that you were very close to your mother and your father. Tell me about that relationship. Did you have one parent over the other that you sort of learned from? And I mean, we always learn from both moms and dads, but we always seem to have gravity towards one parent or the other as far as influences in our lives. How are those relationships for you?
Both of my parents were very strong. They both were educators. And then my dad geared toward law enforcement. And he was first with the deputy sheriff's office. Then when the district attorney asked him to go over and be an investigator at the district attorney, because they didn't have Spanish speakers, right? And my dad went there. My mom, a teacher, a music teacher. But my dad did something very, very different. If you're a little girl growing up in the 50s and early 60s, it was a Barbie era. And women were particularly seeing, not that they aren't now, but about how they looked and how they would fit into society was very different. And when my dad introduced me, and I never quite realized this till I was really in college, he would introduce me as a little girl to someone, this is my daughter, Leticia. And of course, he'd say, oh, what a pretty little girl. And the first thing out of his mouth would be, and she is the smartest in her class. Esta es mi hija Leticia. Ay, ella es la más inteligente de toda su clase. So the constant reinforcement was, it doesn't matter what you look like. It's what's in your heart and what's in your brain. And then when I was 10 or 11, I did not have the Barbie girl figure. I've always had the big thighs. Well, if you've got big thighs, what do? You can run. My dad became a track coach. And coached girls track. And I learned that power and endurance and physical strength were more important than how you looked, because I could run and relay and I could do broad jump and I could do hurdles. And that was powerful, rather than how I looked is how I was built and my strength and endurance and my knowledge. And my dad reinforced that consistently, that I could be anything I wanted to be. And that, I was, of course, going to college, because I am not the first generation. In fact, my grandfather is a pharmacist. So my mom was very different. My mom was so thankful. And she told my sisters and I, and especially me, because I'm the oldest and way older than my little sisters, that we would be the first generation of women who would be defined by who their daddies were or who their husbands were. And that we had every opportunity to succeed, but that it would not be easy. She said, my generation had excuses, mija. When she went to college, that her opportunities was to be a nurse, a social worker, or a teacher. And if you didn't, maybe you could go to technical school and you could be somebody's, a secretary. And she said, but we always had it easy because, she said, we always had an excuse. Oh, my daddy won't let me. My husband doesn't like that. She said, you won't. She said, so if you fail at what you really want to do with life, it's your fault. You can't blame it on anybody. It's your decision. What you make of it, your career, your education, you don't have excuses. Women no longer have excuses. So she says, it's going to be tougher because you have control, you have the opportunity, and you can never be able to say that my daddy doesn't like that and my husband won't let me.
What an important lesson you learned from your mom to be preaching that, because even in those days, it was not something that was, I think, natural. I mean, for mothers to be really saying to their daughters, you can be anything. Now, I know that that's something that many parents do, your mother especially, but coupled with your father's focus on your abilities rather than how you look or whatever. What a great combination. I mean, people don't realize that senators, are made, you obviously are smart and intelligent and have a great background, but having parents that push that and having that combination that you had, what a special gift that they left you with.
There was also that traditionalism. We knew we were loved. We knew that we could be anything. And we, we never suffered. I never knew hunger. I never knew what it was like not to have a meal. And that was primarily because my grandfather, had a pharmacy, and I grew up in this wonderful atmosphere of La Botica Guadalupana. Not only did it have, pharmacy and doctor's offices, but it also carried over 100 hierbas medicinales, herbal medicine. So later, when I practiced there, I got to know the underground medical system of the barrio, the curanderos, and this dichotomy of the old-time herbal, faith-based curandismo and the Western-based pharmacology and medicines. And my grandfather bridged that. And I always wanted to be a pharmacist because of my grandfather. And just that experience alone really helped me. But Jason, I want to share something with you, that there comes a moment in time when there's an event or something that happens that kind of shapes your life or that puts a new perspective. And for me, it was an event that occurred because I was loved. Of course, we did have discrimination. It was very different. It wasn't until I was in pharmacy school that I was just like verbally slapped. And I want to share this because maybe it's important for everyone to realize that they have to have that moment of reckoning. I was in pharmacy school, and my goal when I graduated was to buy myself a red sports car and to buy my mom a washer and a dryer, not to have to put clothes on the clothesline, but a dryer that worked, that's what I wanted to do, right? Simple goals. I wanted to be a pharmacist, but I wanted to do that. And I was in pharmacy class one day, and the professor asked us to go up and do a problem. I did the problem wrong, and I was embarrassed. And my professor said, Miss San Miguel, just because you're white for a Mexican doesn't mean you can make mistakes like that. I was just appalled. It was near the end of the class. Of course, all the other students kind of gasps, and I was enraged, and I approached the professor. I approached her afterwards, and I said, I was wrong, but it had nothing to do with my ethnicity. Nothing to do with my ethnicity. I was not prepared, and I want an apology. And she told me, you make me sick. She said, you've got so much potential, and look around, little girl. You think you're here for you? She said, how many Mexicans do you think they let in? How many girls do you think they let into pharmacy school? And you think you're here for you? And she insulted me again, and I just walked out, and I was crying. I was enraged. And then I began to think about it. Out of the class of 85, right, there was 7 women, and there was only 3 people of color.
Wow.
And this is like 1975. And it hurt. It hurt because part of it was true. From that moment on, everything I did was not about Leticia San Miguel anymore. I was determined to absolutely do my best, but not because of me, but because if I didn't do good, what if they didn't let other women into pharmacy school? And if I didn't do really good, they're not going to let other Latinos, other Hispanics, other people of color in. And maybe I couldn't get hired somewhere, or I never looked at myself in the same vein. It was a turning point for someone who is 20 years old to have this verbal slap that was both offensive yet somewhat true. Now, the story of it, she did apologize in the class the next day, and we became great friends. And maybe there are people that if you sit down with them and you say, hey, I have noticed you've got a lot of potential and you can do this and you're a great student, but you could be so much more. Maybe there are people that can do that. Maybe I wasn't. But from then on, I decided not only was I going to do that, but I was going to get involved in the pharmacy fraternity, the honor fraternity. And I was going to study, and I was going to do everything to the best of my ability. And it's continued because I still think that maybe I hold that as a guilt, that if I don't do good, they're not going to let other women. And I've got to do good, not because of me, but because of the ethnicity, of the gender, of who I am, so that it opens the doors continually for the next.
So many of us have stories like that. When you are in a society in Texas or other places around the country, and you have the dark hair and the brown eyes and the color of your skin is different, people notice that. I know that from having conversations like these with successful Hispanics in Texas, and we've had some excellent conversations with many people. What I hear consistently is that when you're brown, you have to be better than not only your community, but everybody else. You have to always be one step above everyone in order just to be considered the same as the predominant society. So what your story resonates with me, and because I always felt like I wasn't good enough, and everyone always looked at me like, oh, he checked the box. That's how he got into UT Law School, or, oh, he made partner at a big law firm, and that's because, they needed the person of color. But, everyone has that expectation of you. And so you have to be better, and you have to be excellent, and you have to be above. And it sounds like your experience is similar to that, although you were thinking about your successors and the people behind you. So that's that's an impactful story. So you were clearly educated. You're at pharmacy school. Are you political at all at this point? Are you thinking about politics? Is this something that's down the road, or did you have the bug from growing up? How did you start to have an awakening politically?
Was always involved in my neighborhood. Once you start to get involved, it continues a pattern of just caring about your community. So I was involved in my pharmacy association, your profession. I was involved in the Mexican American Business and Professional Women group in the early 80s in San Antonio. It gave me a combination of other Latinas and great projects to work on. I was involved in the school district business advisory council where I owned my pharmacies in the Edgewood School District. And then you get involved in the community and you notice things like a park not getting the funding as the other areas of there, and government's reaction when you complain, whether at the local level especially, is, hey, don't just complain, come be part of the solution. So I found myself on the airport advisory board in the 80s. I found myself on the parks advisory board. I found myself in Centro 21, which is the planning for the downtown transit planning. And so I had been involved locally on things, and I had like a child every 2 years. So I was constantly pregnant or nursing, having been by then buying my own pharmacies, and then being involved in your kid's school and in church. So very active. But in 1978, my husband's dearest friend decided to run for the legislature, and my husband became his treasurer. And I was kind of the person behind the scenes, along with folks, having the neighborhood coffees and helping with the little fundraisers, stuffing the envelopes. And we began to be politically active, but kind of behind the scenes, never as a candidate. And I'm sorry. I had 6 kids in 9 years. I owned pharmacies. I had enough on my plate. But there was a vacancy at the legislature. And it happened between the primary and the general election. And when that happens, the different parties, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, if that occurs, has to fill the vacancy on the ballot. And so this is 1990, and this is now August of 1990. And the state rep decided to run for a different position on the Fourth Court of Appeals because of a vacancy. Therefore, he was going to vacate his spot. And the precinct chairs were going to decide. And I was a Democratic precinct chair. I was involved. And there were 5 guys that put their names in. All, really qualified, great guys from labor, lawyers. But there wasn't any women, and there certainly weren't any small business owners. And there wasn't any healthcare professionals. And a group of women came to me and said, you need to put your name in. And I said, I really have a lot on my plate. And besides, I'm still nursing my last baby. I got a lot going on here. But they said, well, just put your name in because you're qualified and everything. And talked to my husband and said, put your name in. It's a selection process. So I thought, okay, well, I'll put my name in because if not, there's no women, there's no business owners, and there's certainly no healthcare providers. And I was angry. I was angry because I thought, they don't give enough attention to small business at the legislature. Who's running the ship on healthcare? Because why is it that we pay for, at that time, a baby only on Medicaid the minute they're born, but they couldn't even give prenatal vitamins to mom? I mean, come on, let's try to cut down on the expenses in the neonatal intensive care unit. Why don't we give mom the prenatal care so we don't have those costs, right? And then I really loved veterans and simply, I think that's my dad and the family. And I thought, we're not living up to our promises on veterans. And nobody was talking about that. So I put my name in, and then we were talking to the children about what it would mean if mommy actually had to be in Austin for the legislative session. And we were trying to explain. And our youngest daughter said, well, mommy, why do you want to be a state representative? And we all kind of chuckled because she didn't even know how to say it. And at that time, my 10-year-old, our oldest, looked at her and she said, because there's just not enough mommies there. And it hit Pete and I, and it hit me. There weren't enough mommies. So in 1990, there were about a dozen women in the 150-member House. And there were 2 Latinas. And one of them we know was going to be appointed to another position. So I knew I had to. And from that moment on, it was that little voice kicking in of do your best, do your best. And it ended up that I was the choice. And I had no support from the Democratic leaders or party leaders or organized labor or the trial lawyers or anything. But I ended up winning because I was everybody's neighborhood pharmacist, because I had grown up in that district. I still lived there. I had been so involved. And what you don't realize is if you just live your life and care about your community and get involved in the community in not-for-profits or in your churches and schools, you get a network. And what happened is I had a huge network of people who weren't so-called democratic activists and weren't really political, but were excited that I would be in that political realm. And
that first race is so special, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's kind of what happened. And so I found myself in kind of September of 1990, realizing I'm on the ballot. And then in 1991, taking the oath of office. And the only other time I'd been at the Capitol was when I went in seventh grade, is your seventh grade tour. You think about it, wow. But don't let anybody ever tell you no. If you feel it's in your heart and you feel you have something to offer, but when you decide, and that moment of decision sometimes for those people who want to enter public service or want to do something really, really important to the community, it doesn't have to be an elected position. It can be an appointed position, a board or a commission, or leading an effort, is just do your best and make sure that it's not for you, but it's for the greater good. It's for the public good. And you do that, you're going to be successful.
Your point is so valid. You know, in those races, if it's about you, if you're looking to seek an office for the glory of it, then you're going to fail. But if it's about the community, you do so well because your network and you're talking to people at the front doors and you're real and you're genuine. You know, when I won my first race, it was like that as well. And people will say, "How did you win?" I didn't have the support of the establishment either. And I had this unpronounceable last name in a very Anglo district. But I just went to the front doors and said, look, I'm a dad and I'm a member of a law firm. And I'm just trying to, you know, make sure we've got safe streets and good businesses and, you know, the basics, right? And people, that message resonated with people, and your community obviously understood your value to it. That's a really cool story. You're such a groundbreaker, not only as a Latina, but a mom, being one of 8 and in pharmacy school, and then being one of the few moms. I mean, you're a nursing mother in the legislature in 91. I mean, that must have been something pretty powerful for the media at the time. What was it like to be, you know, one of only a few women in the legislature at that time?
It was very special in that the members of the legislature, other women, I was mentored by the great Irma Rangel. Judy Zaffarini, the senator on the other side, just took me under her wing. But there were bipartisan leaders that helped. M.A. Taylor, Republican from Waco, was so wonderful to me in teaching me the rules of how the process is in a committee, and Chairman Barton. So I found that it was very welcoming. But I've always known, Jason, that I have an ability to talk to people and make them feel comfortable. And part of that is my pharmacy background, because you learn as a pharmacist, you have to listen first, right? You really have to listen first before you start talking to people and see where their concerns are. And it's the communication skills. And most folks don't know, you know, you have 150,000 constituents if you're a House member, and you've got, now almost 1 million if you're a senator. But once you're in the legislative session, you have 180 constituents. You have to convince the other 180 elected members of the legislature that your bill is just superb, and you know they have to vote yes for it. Well, you've got to form those relationships. You've got to use that persuasion of the greater good and why it's important public policy, or what is that. And what I found is that my ability to talk to people and really to listen to them first was really helpful. And then, gotta admit, I really am good at mediating adolescent disputes with all the kids. And sometimes tensions get so high in very high stakes decision making that you get that adolescent type behavior. And I knew how to focus it to get it back to normal, to bring it back to the discussion and the main point, and to use humor. Sometimes if you use humor, you can get it back. So you use all your skill set. And what helped me was, again, my grandmother and my great-grandfather, those people from Jalisco, they've got this funky sense of humor. And even when a room is so tense and you're about ready to go to blows and you think they'd say something so off the wall that everybody starts laughing and it breaks the tension in the room. I kind of learned that from them and use that several times. So you just use whatever you can. And it's always been so helpful. In the entire time I was in the legislature, I really never felt uncomfortable, because people have asked me, did you feel uncomfortable yet? Well, let me tell you, it was tough for women because I don't golf, right? So, I wasn't going on the golf course to talk to folks, but I adapted my methods of communication to whomever I'm talking to. And I think it's important now for our youth and our leaders to understand, don't be so arrogant. If you absolutely need to talk to someone, understand what their preferred method of communication is. And with technology now, you have people that prefer that verbal phone call, you have emailers, you have texters, you have folks that use different methods of communication. I prefer one. But if I need to visit with that person, I'm going to adapt to use that method of communication that they prefer, because I need results. So don't be so arrogant in demanding that people shift to you. Be variable, adapt, so that you can get results. Because again, in a situation like, the legislature or as a leader, it's not about you. It's about the people that you represent and about the ability to find that common ground and maintain your integrity. You put kind of the families first and make sure that you keep your integrity, but adapt your communication style to get the results that you need.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you, you were so revered in your time in the legislature. You were so successful really at everything that you touched in the legislature, from legislation to committee work to what you did. So many of us, including myself, had a hard time staying grounded during that time. I know my wife complained that I was a different person during and after that time. How did you stay grounded during that time? What was your secret?
You keep home. You come back, people especially call you senator, you call you stuff, but I have a husband that pretty much keeps us all grounded and reinforce the fact that the house doesn't operate unless we have fresh salsa and frijoles. My house will just, for some reason, if there is not frijoles, we just cannot manage, right? So you'll tell me, hey, we're getting low on frijoles, or hey, we're out of salsa. And the thought that I would ask him to go to the store, they've got some great salsas, at the HEB. And he said, you want me to buy salsa in a jar? Oh, God. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Were you coming home each night, or were you staying in Austin?
I would come back and forth the beginning part of the session when you're not required to be there all the time, until I got on House Appropriations. And then when you're on appropriations, so probably by my third session, I knew that I really needed an apartment there in Austin, because you're working late. And then the entire time, I was in the Senate, because you're on so many committees. But I would come back and forth as much as I could. But when you come home, you do the laundry, you make meals. And what I did was I would make 4 or 5 dinner entrees on Sundays before I'd head back, so that my family would be taken care of. I mean, they could put together a salad, or here's some vegetables here and stuff. But the main entrees, I would do a bunch of cooking and leave it. Okay, here's for Monday night, here's Tuesday night, here's Wednesday night.
Now I'm feeling really guilty, because my only job during the legislature was to be in the legislature. And here you were, a mom to 6, making dinners, going back and forth on appropriations, running a pharmacy.
Yeah, well, running the pharmacy was the tough part. I would put the kids to bed on Sunday nights and then head back to the pharmacy, because I had to put in my narcotic order, do the stuff. And I had great pharmacy managers. And the other thing that lessons learned from my wise grandfather is don't think that you're the only one that can do something. You may think you're the only one that can do it the best, but the more that you can delegate and grow your team, that you can grow your managers, your staff, then they're not dependent on you. And if you believe in people and you train them correctly, you're not the only person that can do this job or this task. So again, don't allow yourself that arrogance of thinking you're the only person that can do this. The narcotic order, I'm sorry, the pharmacist in charge has to put that in. And the financial part, definitely, I had to do. But the real problem was there were times where I got very little sleep, 4 to 5 hours all the time. And that's not healthy. If I would do anything again, it would be to try to readjust more, to sleep a little bit more, because that does put wear and tear on you. And then you never realize how much pressure you're under until you leave. And I know that you've experienced this. It becomes the normal that you're under constant stress or that you're always worried, so that when it's relieved, it's a different world. You don't realize because it becomes the natural. You're always thinking about the constituents, or you're always thinking about that business. And what lessons learned for me is do what you need to do to keep yourself balanced. And I had a great friend, in fact, my business partner, that gave me the best advice. And she said, just, Leticia, you need to be where your feet are.
Your story is just so impactful, and it just brings back a lot for me. Certainly, I was out of balance towards the end and needed to be home and spending more time with my children and my wife, and being a better husband and provider before I was a legislator. And I'm just so impressed by people like you who are able to do it and keep it together and be so successful. Not only were you successful in the House, but you ended up in the Texas Senate. You did amazing things there. Tell me about that first race to get into the Senate and what drove you over to the other chamber.
It was a vacancy. I had completed the 99 legislative session in the House and had pretty much decided, this is my 5th session. My daughter was in her first year of college, and the stark realization that in the next 4 to 6 years, we would have 4 children in college at the same time terrified me, especially knowing that every time I walked into the legislative session, that my income would drop. Because if I wasn't there as a pharmacist, when I owned my pharmacies, I'd have to pay somebody to be the pharmacist there. And then after I sold my pharmacies, I was still working part-time. And I was still working, when I would go back home. We had too many kids. So I had decided with a husband, 10 years in the legislature, loved representing San Antonio, but it's really probably time to come back because of just, we're going to have so many kids in college. And then my Senator Gregory Luna, beloved, became very, very ill. And he resigned due to health, and he subsequently passed away. I looked at kind of the landscape and who could possibly fill his position. And again, it was a list of folks and no women, a couple of the other House members, but one that I didn't particularly think put people first. And I talked about it with Pete, and you make those decisions and decided, well, okay, instead of I'm going to try to leave the House, but it's a special election. I'll put my name in. Won the special election. We went to a runoff, and then the person that I beat, another House member, withdrew from the runoff. But that was in November of 99. Then I had a March primary and then a runoff there. So basically 4 elections or 3 elections in a period of about, 4 or 5 months. But then once I got to the Senate, it was an interim. And I've got to tell you that I was greatly assisted not only by the senators, but at the time, the lieutenant governor was a guy named Rick Perry. And Miss Betty King, the Secretary of the Senate, and the other senators, I knew the workings of the House, had done major state bills, the telecom total reform, co-authored, the rewrite of the juvenile code, the venues facility bill, which allowed us to build Reliant Stadium, AT&T, Jerry's World, those types of major bills I'd been a part of, and get to the Senate and you're at the bottom of the totem pole again. And yet the portfolios were so big. It was a great lesson. And I have to thank Governor Perry, the other senators, excellent staff, and of course, my dear friend, Judith Zaffirini, who has always been the combination of that guardian angel in Madrina.
You've always been a consensus builder. You've always been someone who has represented the district and in both the House and the Senate as someone who is mindful of the community rather than the politics of it. Would you describe yourself as a centrist? I know you're a Democrat. Would you describe yourself as progressive? And if so, how do you formulate those political leanings? I mean, is that something that started when you were a kid? Is that something that you learned over the time in the legislature? Or, you're obviously a person that's successful, so that means you're probably working from both sides. But what were your political leanings and how did those formulate?
My parents were always very, very involved. I remember the presidential election, my mom got a little John F. Kennedy sign to put in the yard. And then my dad, on the other side of the sidewalk of the yard, put a Nixon sign. And then my mom got a bigger sign. And so then my dad got a bigger sign. My parents talked about politics, talked about leadership. I understood. And I think a defining thing for understanding that was the day of the presidential assassination of John F. Kennedy, to be a small girl in elementary school and to see every adult that you come in contact with crying and parents coming to pick up kids and then everybody glued to the TV and a nation in mourning, that really sets a different tone. Going to college and seeing all the protesters for the Vietnam War and college very activist. But actually, my parents were very active because my godfather was a state senator. Joe Bernal is actually my padrino. And my parents held the first little fundraiser for him in our backyard. So I was very, very young, right? But my godfather was the state senator. He is still alive today and has been a great help. And of course, he left way before I served, but he had the Senate seat that I got to serve in. So it was Joe Bernal. But he and my madrina, his wife, Mary Esther, and my mom went to Our Lady of the Lake University together. That's how that friendship began.
So you're successful in the Senate and you, again, do amazing things. And then you decide to run for lieutenant governor against, I believe it was Dan Patrick at the time. Why, number one, that race? And what was it like at that level? I mean, that's a whole different level than
absolutely.
the House and the Senate. What was it like?
Again, I was approaching 24 years plus in the legislature. I felt comfortable that there would be great candidates should I decide to vacate the seat or not run again from Bexar County that were very qualified. So I had no doubts that the people wouldn't be taken care of. And I figured it was time to do something else. I thought about going and was really very pleased to work with the Obama administration. And I thought that was an opportunity. And that was kind of my plan right after the 2013 legislative session. And then some tragic things occurred. So sometimes events in our lives, either personal or worldwide, can cause an effect. And for us, it was the untimely death of our grandson at age 6 months from sudden infant death syndrome in May of 2013. The baby just didn't wake up one morning, and it was during session, and it's my son and at the time his wife who lived in Austin. And then 6 weeks later, my dad was killed in a traffic accident. And then an uncle, beloved uncle of Pete, and then an employee of the flag company, and then Pete's mom in September. Again, 5 unintended deaths in the period between May and September. And I mean, these are ones where I've really had to go in and make those funeral arrangements, to sit in the room at the funeral home, to make the arrangements, to do everything. And our family was reeling from just death. And the Obama administration, the president was very kind and said, just take your time on deciding. But I knew that I couldn't leave Texas. I couldn't leave my family. I couldn't. So this was 2013. We thought about, well, what do we do? And we needed something to change our personal shift in the Van de Putte family from funerals and death. We needed a project. We needed a distraction. And there were folks that were trying to convince me to run for lieutenant governor. And I knew that it was a really uphill battle. But there was two dear friends and one a special one that said, we'll help you. And it is an uphill battle. And we didn't know if it would be the current lieutenant governor, David Dewhurst, or the challenger, probably Dan Patrick. But in either case, I didn't want to go to DC. I couldn't leave. And I thought, well, it's a project and I'll help. Again, there had not really been a high profile Latina on a statewide candidate, and decided to do that. And it is something that, even though the odds were always against us, I would do again in a heartbeat, because my family and I got to fall in love with Texas all over again. We got to visit people all the way from El Paso to the Panhandle to East Texas, and in the rural communities and the beautiful Rio Grande Valley. And 201, Texans love this state and they love their communities. And to see that and to experience the joy of that, and really, they want the same things. And we knew it was an uphill battle. Put together a great team of young people and did a lot of bus tours and a lot of help. So was not victorious in that, but made so many contacts. And I've got to tell you that there are 6 members of the current House who were then on my campaign team in 2014.
Wow. That race was something else. I watched you on the campaign trail, and it was clear that you just enjoyed being with the people. That was so evident to me that you were in it for the right reasons. I was cheering for you quietly. Of course, I was an active Republican at the time, but was just so impressed. I've always been impressed by your story, number one, and then by your campaign, which I thought was really well run. I loved your stump speech. I loved watching you campaign. The numbers were against you, not because of you, or it was Texas at the time. I mean, it's still, that was what, 2013, 14 is still pretty red state. It's changing. Texas is changing. We've seen that in the last several cycles. It's becoming much more purple. What do you think is happening in Texas? Do you think that we are headed for, the blue wave that's been predicted for several cycles now? Is that coming? And if so, will the senator be a part of that wave at some point in time in the future?
I want to see great people, committed people of integrity lead this state. But I really doubt that I will put my name on a ballot again. I think almost 24 years in the Texas legislature, and the great efforts that worked with other people to accomplish. And I learned more from sometimes when I fell short and the errors that I made than when we actually won, that we got things across. But for me, being a public official, I think that's totally out of the picture. I am really loving what I'm doing now. People can lead and can affect their communities and can affect this state by playing different roles, by helping organize, by connecting people together on projects, and being committed locally and being committed statewide. So I think I'm going to continue on that vein. And I am a Democrat. I've got to tell you, I am absolutely thrilled with the change in administration at the federal level, and will help any way I can there. But I've also made it clear that my family does need me now as well. that's what always drives me. And because we now have our son and his children living with us, that's where my passion is right now, is helping our son after the untimely death of his wife, after, she had gallbladder surgery, helping our son with the kids and making more memories. It's really great to be on those Zoom calls, but then I have to go and help the fourth grader do his online stuff. There's great joy in it.
What a great time this has been with you. I love these conversations because of the morsels of wisdom that people like you drop. I mean, from the lessons that your grandfather taught you to the lessons that your father taught you, to Hope's words to stay where your feet are, to life experience. I mean, hearing and learning from you, for me, is an honor, and I'm thankful for your leadership of Texas. I'm thankful for your great contributions to our state and to our community, and I look forward to spending more time with you. I get to San Antonio frequently, and so I'm looking forward to some of those tortillas and frijoles that you speak of. And so I hope to get down there and break bread with you once we all get vaccinated. But thank you again for being on Our Story, Senator. It's just been a wonderful time, and I look forward to hearing from you again. This is Jason Villalba from the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation. Thank you for joining us this week, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Talk to you soon. Thanks. Goodbye.
The Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation would like to thank you for joining us today on Our Story. You can find more information about the foundation at www.txhpf.org, on Facebook on the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation page, or on Twitter @TexHPF. Please join us next week on Our Story, a podcast dedicated to the voices of Texas Hispanics.